The year was 1305. London streets, usually alive with the shouts of merchants and the rhythm of horse hooves on stone, carried a darker weight that morning. From every corner, a restless tide of people surged forward, drawn by the promise of blood. The air thickened with anticipation, the roar of a crowd hungry for spectacle. At the center of their cruel excitement stood a single man, William Wallace, a name whispered in both fear and reverence. But what awaited him was not death alone. It was a punishment so savage, so unthinkably brutal, that history itself would struggle to contain its horror. The year was 1305, and the Kingdom of England stood tall under the iron fist of King Edward III. London's streets were restless, a city alive with wealth, cruelty, and whispers of power. To the common man, it was a place of survival. Merchants shouted over one another, desperate to sell goods before their competitors. The clang of blacksmith hammers, the smell of roasting meat, the braying of donkeys, and the choking smoke from countless hearths created a city that never truly slept. But beneath this noisy facade lurked something darker, the hum of fear, the scent of violence, the echo of hatred against a people the English crown deemed inferior: the Scots. England had waged long wars against its northern neighbor. For years, Scotland had been viewed not as an equal kingdom, but as a rebellious land, a place to be tamed, beaten, and bent under English law. In taverns and marketplaces, the very word Scot was often spat like venom, uttered with disgust and derision. To be Scottish in the eyes of Londoners was to be savage, barbaric, unworthy of dignity. This was not just war between nations, it was war between identities, races, and entire cultures. King Edward III, known as the Hammer of the Scots, ruled with merciless ambition. His court overflowed with wealth stolen from campaigns abroad. His knights swaggered through the streets with the arrogance of conquerors, and his nobles whispered about the need to break Scotland once and for all. Edward's army had burned villages, desecrated churches, and slaughtered innocents in the name of order. And in the shadows of these atrocities, one name rose louder than any other: William Wallace. Wallace was no ordinary man. To the Scots, he was a living symbol of resistance, a towering figure who had struck fear into the heart of England's armies. But to Edward's court, he was a criminal, a traitor, a barbarian who dared to defy the crown. And in 1305, after years of war, betrayal, and bloodshed, he was brought in chains to face his reckoning. But before London's crowd would see him torn apart, before the executioner's hands touched him, there was a story that stretched back years, a story of loss, of fire, of a people brutalized because of who they were, and a man who dared to rise against it. Scotland at the dawn of the 14th century was not a land of peace. Villages stood half-burned, fields were stripped bare by English soldiers, and families lived with the constant dread of raids. Children grew up watching their fathers beaten for defiance, their mothers forced to beg for scraps, their churches desecrated by soldiers who saw their prayers as rebellion. The English crown had not merely sought to conquer Scotland, it sought to erase its spirit. Laws forbade the carrying of arms, taxes strangled the poor, and punishments for even the smallest act of defiance were swift and merciless. A Scottish man who refused to kneel before an English knight could be flogged in the town square. A woman who resisted an English soldier's cruelty could be branded, humiliated before her neighbors. To be Scottish was to carry a mark of shame in the eyes of England, to live under the weight of systemic racism that sought to crush an entire culture. But from this soil of oppression rose resistance, small bands of fighters, fueled not by wealth or training but by desperation and pride, began to fight back. They ambushed English patrols, raided supply lines, and struck terror into the invaders. Their struggle was not just for freedom, but for dignity, for the right to exist as Scots, as a people whose identity could not be erased. At the heart of this storm was Wallace. Little is known with certainty about Wallace's early years, but the legends that grew around him painted a picture of a man shaped by cruelty and injustice. Born into a land already under English threat, he carried the scars of oppression from a young age. His family, like countless others, lived under the boot of English law, their lives dictated by foreign lords. But Wallace refused to bow. Where others bent their heads to survive, he stood, tall. He struck back at those who abused his people, and his defiance spread like wildfire. Soon he was no longer just a man, he was a symbol. A name whispered in Scottish villages with hope, and cursed in English courts with rage. To the English crown, Wallace was dangerous not merely because of his sword, but because of what he represented. He embodied the idea that the Scots were not inferior, that they could fight back, that they could refuse to be erased. That was why Edward Lion hunted him so mercilessly. Wallace was not just a rebel, he was a threat to the very narrative of English superiority. Imagine being Scottish in those years. Imagine walking through your village, seeing English soldiers stationed at every corner, their armor glinting in the sun as a reminder of your submission. Imagine hearing your own language mocked, your customs forbidden, your people called savages, in your own land. Imagine knowing that the very air you breathed was considered unworthy because it came from Scottish lungs. This was not simply conquest, it was a campaign of dehumanization. To the English lords, the Scots were a race to be subdued, their traditions broken, their pride ground into dust. Every punishment was designed not just to control, but to humiliate. Every execution was a spectacle, meant to remind the people that resistance was futile. And yet, resistance grew. Wallace became the living embodiment of that defiance, a man who refused to accept the role of victim. With every skirmish, every ambush, every victory, he reminded his people that they were not powerless. He gave them something even more dangerous than weapons. He gave them belief. And now in August of 1305, that belief was about to be tested in the most horrific way. Word spread quickly through London streets. William Wallace, the so-called barbarian, the so-called traitor, had been captured. He was to be brought before the king's justice, and the people would see him broken. Merchants abandoned their stalls to gossip about the man whose name had once made English armies tremble. Children whispered about the giant who fought with unmatched fury. The wealthy prepared to take seats in the viewing stands, eager to witness the humiliation of the Scot who dared to rise. The poor, many of whom had only known suffering under the crown, came too, but with quieter eyes, some even secretly admiring the man who had defied the oppressors. London itself seemed to pulse with anticipation. Banners hung heavy in the wind, soldiers patrolled with extra vigilance, and the execution ground was prepared with a cruelty that promised more than simple death. This was not just an execution, it was a spectacle, a warning carved in flesh and blood, and in the center of it all was Wallace, chained, silent, carrying the weight of his people's suffering on his shoulders. The city waited, the crowd roared, and history prepared to etch one of its darkest chapters. Long before his name became legend, William Wallace was simply another son of Scotland, raised in a land fractured by war and shadowed by English dominance. The exact details of his childhood were blurred by time, but what was certain was that he grew up surrounded by injustice. Every boy in Scotland learned early that to be born Scottish was to be born into a world that despised you. The English crown treated them not as equals, but as subjects to be beaten into obedience. From the moment Wallace was old enough to understand the world around him, he saw what that hatred meant. He watched as villages were raided, men forced into servitude, and women left to beg after their families were slaughtered. His earliest memories were not of peace but of fire and chains. The boy who would one day stand against an empire grew up in a culture suffocated by racial prejudice. The English viewed the Scots as wild and uncivilized, brutes to be controlled, savages to be silenced. To be Scottish meant to be mocked, scorned, and punished simply for existing. For Wallace, these lessons sank deep into his bones. By the late 13th century, Scotland's independence had been ground nearly to dust. Edward I's campaigns were relentless, and his army swept across the land with iron discipline. Castles were seized, noble families were forced to swear allegiance, and entire communities were taxed into starvation. But it was not enough to control Scotland militarily. Edward wanted to strip the Scots of their very identity. Scottish laws were replaced by English decrees. Local leaders were executed or imprisoned. Families were torn apart, their lands handed over to English lords who sneered at their subjects as if they were livestock. Racial humiliation was a weapon as sharp as any blade. In many towns, Scots were forbidden to carry weapons, forbidden to gather in groups, forbidden even to raise their voices in protest. To break these laws meant torture, mutilation, or death. The English soldiers, drunk with power, enforced their king's will with cruelty that echoed through generations. For Wallace, this world was intolerable. He saw the degradation of his people, the broken spirits of men who had once held their heads high, and he could not accept it. Where others bent to survive, Wallace stood straighter. Where others whispered of injustice, he roared against it. Legends tell that Wallace's first acts of defiance began as small sparks, ambushing patrols, refusing to kneel before English officers, striking back when dishonor was thrown at him. These sparks grew into flames, and soon he had gathered others who shared his anger. Farmers, outlaws, desperate men who had lost everything under English rule. Together, they became the seeds of rebellion. Every strike against the English was more than just a battle. It was a statement. Wallace was telling his people that they were not slaves, that their lives had value, that their voices still mattered. Each victory, however small, became a beacon of hope. But hope came at a price. The English crown seethed with rage. Every defeat, every rumor of Wallace's defiance was an insult Edward could not ignore. He vowed to crush Wallace, to grind him into the earth as an example of what happened when a Scot dared to resist. The struggle escalated into war. Wallace's forces, though often outnumbered and outmatched, fought with a ferocity born from desperation. They ambushed supply lines, struck swiftly, and vanished into the highlands before the English could retaliate. One of his most legendary moments came at the Battle of Stirling Bridge in 1297. Against overwhelming odds, Wallace and his men used strategy and terrain to defeat a much larger English force. The victory sent shockwaves through England, shaking their belief in their superiority. For the Scots, it was a moment of triumph, proof that they could defy the impossible. But victories like Stirling only deepened Edward's hatred. He would not allow a Scottish rebel, least of all one despised for his race and defiance, to humiliate his armies. The English campaign grew more brutal. Villages were burned, prisoners mutilated, and traitors hunted without mercy. Wallace, once a man in the shadows, became a name every English noble spat with venom. To the people of Scotland, he was a hero. To the English, he was a barbarian who needed to be erased from history. Triumph, however, is fragile. After Stirling, the English regrouped. In 1298, at the Battle of Falkirk, Edward's forces crushed Wallace's army with sheer numbers and superior weaponry. Though Wallace escaped with his life, the defeat marked a turning point. The Scottish nobles, fearful of Edward's wrath and jealous of Wallace's rising influence, began to turn against him. Betrayal seeped into his cause. Where once he had been supported, now he found himself hunted not just by English soldiers, but by his own countrymen who sought favor with the crown. Yet Wallace did not yield. He refused to surrender, refused to kneel, refused to accept that Scotland's fate was sealed. For years he fought as a fugitive, moving through forests and hills, always one step ahead of his pursuers. But Edward's will was unrelenting. The king would not rest until Wallace was dragged in chains to London, paraded before the crowd, and destroyed in a spectacle that would silence rebellion forever. By 1305, Wallace's world had narrowed to shadows and betrayal. Once hailed as a champion, he now lived as a hunted man. The English crown placed a bounty on his head, promising wealth and favor to anyone who delivered him. It was not English soldiers who finally caught him, but a fellow Scot, John de Menteith, a noble who betrayed Wallace for gold and safety. This act of treachery cut deeper than any blade. Betrayed not just by his enemies but by his own people, Wallace was seized, bound in chains, and handed to the English like a prize beast. The betrayal marked more than the fall of a man. It was a symbol of the crushing power of England's rule. A people so divided, so brutalized, that they would sell their own hero to survive. From that moment, Wallace's fate was sealed. His journey to London would not be a march of defiance, but a parade of humiliation. The English crown would make certain that his death would be more than execution. It would be theater, a demonstration of dominance, a ritual of racial hatred carved into flesh and bone. The night William Wallace was betrayed was heavy with silence. He had survived years as a fugitive, slipping through forests and mountains, evading both English patrols and Scottish traitors. Yet in the end, it was not English cunning that trapped him. It was the greed of one of his own countrymen. John de Menteith, a Scottish noble who sought favour with Edward I, delivered Wallace into English hands. There was no clash of swords, no heroic last stand. There was only the sound of chains clinking as Wallace was bound, his towering frame subdued by sheer numbers. For a man who had spent his life defying submission, the weight of those irons was a cruelty in itself. His capture was more than the fall of a rebel. It was a wound to the soul of Scotland, a reminder of how division and betrayal could shatter even the strongest of causes. From the moment Wallace was seized, his journey was as much theatre as punishment. He was paraded through towns and villages on his way to London, displayed like a trophy for English subjects to jeer at. Soldiers forced him to walk through crowded marketplaces where merchants spat at his feet and children hurled stones. Every step southward was designed to strip away his dignity. He was mocked as a savage, cursed as a traitor, and denounced as less than human. For the English, Wallace was not simply a prisoner. He was a symbol of everything they despised. His Scottish blood, his defiance, his refusal to kneel. These were traits they believed must be crushed publicly, brutally, and permanently. The common people crowded to see him, their faces twisted with the excitement of cruelty. Some shouted insults. Others laughed and a few stared in uneasy silence, sensing that the man before them carried a weight far heavier than chains. Wallace walked with quiet resolve, his silence louder than their jeers. Wallace's arrival in London was marked not by secrecy, but by spectacle. Edward I wanted his people to see the man who had defied him. The message was clear. Here was the so-called giant of Scotland, reduced to chains, dragged like an animal into the heart of English power. Crowds filled the streets as Wallace was led through the city. The air reeked of sweat, smoke, and anticipation. The wealthy leaned from balconies, eager to see the infamous rebel. The poor pressed forward, desperate for a glimpse of the man whose defiance had shaken kings. But Wallace was not greeted with respect. He was forced to endure humiliation at every turn. English officials proclaimed his crimes loudly, branding him a murderer, a traitor, and a barbarian. Placards displaying false accusations were carried before him, ensuring that even those who had never heard his name would see him as a monster. This was not justice, it was performance. Wallace's trial would not be a trial at all, but a formality designed to seal his fate. Edward had already written the ending. The court was merely the stage upon which the play would unfold. For the English, Wallace's Scottish identity was as damning as any of his actions. They did not see him as a man fighting for freedom. They saw him as a lesser being daring to challenge their superiority. His capture was not just military victory, it was racial triumph. The language used against him was telling. He was called barbarian, savage, beast. He was depicted in propaganda as less than human, a figure of mockery rather than a warrior. In their eyes, Wallace was not a leader defending his people, he was an animal to be hunted, displayed, and destroyed. This dehumanization was essential to the English crown's narrative. To admit that Wallace had fought for dignity and independence would be to admit that the Scots had cause for rebellion. Instead, they painted him as a criminal, a madman who needed to be put down for the good of order. But beneath the cruelty of this narrative lay a deeper fear. The English knew Wallace's story could not be erased. They knew that even in chains he was still a symbol of resistance. That was why his death could not be ordinary. It had to be unforgettable. By the time Wallace reached London in August of 1305, the city was alive with feverish anticipation. Rumors had spread of the horrors that awaited him, and thousands gathered to witness the spectacle. For many, it was entertainment, a chance to see cruelty dressed as justice. For Edward and his court, it was a message. Rebellion would be met with suffering so profound that no one would dare repeat it. London's narrow streets echoed with the murmur of the crowd. Alehouses overflowed with patrons discussing what they hoped to say. Would Wallace scream? Would he beg? Would his body shatter under the punishment? The people craved answers not out of justice, but out of hunger for blood. The city itself became part of the performance. Banners were hung, guards lined the routes, and the execution grounds were prepared with meticulous care. The punishment designed for Wallace was not a simple death. It was an ordeal that would linger in the minds of all who saw it, a ritual of degradation meant to echo through generations. And yet, as he was marched through London, William Wallace did not break. His silence cut through the noise, his eyes unbowed even as insults rained down upon him. He had no illusions about his fate. He knew death awaited him. But in his composure, in his refusal to cower, he carried the dignity of a people who refused to vanish. To the English crowd, he was a spectacle. To the Scottish heart, even in chains, he remained a symbol of defiance. Every step he took toward his doom was a reminder that Edward could kill the man, but he could not kill the spirit he represented. As night fell on the eve of his execution, London buzzed with anticipation. The scaffold was ready, the sentence predetermined. Wallace's final hours were not his own. They belonged to the crowd, to the king, to history itself. In the morning, he would be dragged through the city once more, subjected to horrors designed to strip away his humanity. His death would be a ritual of cruelty, a theater of punishment staged for the eyes of thousands. But even as the instruments of torture were prepared, even as the crowd's appetite sharpened, there remained a question that haunted the silence. Would Wallace's end silence his cause, or ignite it forever? The dawn of August 23rd, 1305, broke not with light but with shadow. London's streets swelled with bodies, every alley choked with men, women and children eager to feast on cruelty. The name William Wallace had long been spat with venom, and now the people demanded a spectacle that matched the legend. Wallace was dragged from his cell, shackled and bound to a wooden hurdle, a crude cart pulled by horses. Chains cut into his flesh as the cart lurched forward, dragging him across the filthy streets. The crowd roared with laughter and jeers, hurling insults, garbage, even stones. To them, this was entertainment. To Edward, it was theatre. Placards declaring Wallace a traitor to the king were carried before him, erasing his struggle and branding him a criminal. His victories, his defiance, his fight for Scotland's freedom reduced to lies shouted in the streets. Children mocked him as he passed. Mothers pointed him out as though he were a beast in a cage. Every step was humiliation, a deliberate attempt to strip away his dignity. Yet Wallace remained silent. He did not beg. He did not curse. He let the storm wash over him, his eyes fixed forward as though he carried a truth the crowd could not understand. That silence unsettled some. It was not the silence of a broken man, but of one who refused to surrender his spirit. As the cart jolted through the city, the punishment escalated. Wallace was forced to endure a gauntlet of cruelty, beaten by soldiers, spat upon by priests who condemned him, mocked by nobles who saw his downfall as proof of English superiority. His body was battered, but his presence remained unbowed. The execution ground loomed at Smithfield, a place where justice and spectacle collided in savage ritual. The crowd pressed closer, their anticipation rising with every heartbeat. They had seen executions before, but this promised something darker. Wallace would not be granted a clean death. He would be made an example, his body turned into a warning to every Scot who dared to dream of freedom. The instruments of torture waited, ropes, knives, iron hooks. The executioners sharpened their blades in full view, feeding the crowd's hunger. Children sat on their fathers' shoulders, nobles jostled for the best vantage points, and merchants sold food as though it were a festival. Death had become entertainment, and through it all, Wallace stood, or rather endured, not as a man about to die, but as a symbol of defiance. The English could chain his body, parade him in disgrace, and prepare to tear him apart. But they could not erase the truth that clung to him, that he had fought not for crime, but for freedom. The rising roar of the crowd was not just noise, it was the drumbeat of history. What followed would be horror beyond imagining, but even before the first blade touched him, Wallace had already carved his place in eternity. The cart ground to a halt at Smithfield, its wheels caked with filth, its wooden frame dripping with the blood and grime collected from the long drag across London. The crowd surged forward in anticipation, a sea of faces hungry for the promised spectacle. This was not justice, it was theatre, and the stage had been set with a cruelty so deliberate it bordered on ritual. Wallace was dragged from the cart, his body broken from the journey. Chains clanged against his skin, tearing at his flesh with every movement. He stumbled, but soldiers yanked him upright, forcing him to stand before the mob. Placards hung over his head declaring him a traitor, though the truth of his struggle, the fight for his people's freedom, was nowhere to be seen. A priest stepped forward, offering him one last chance to beg forgiveness, to admit guilt before God and King. Wallace said nothing. His silence was not weakness, it was defiance louder than any plea. The crowd jeered, enraged by the absence of submission. Edward's design was working. Humiliation first, death second. Then came the first stage. Wallace was stripped naked before the crowd. His humanity peeled away as though he were no more than an animal. His body bore scars of war, marks of rebellion, but now they would be erased by scars of English cruelty. He was bound tightly to a wooden frame, spread open for all to see. Laughter erupted from the mob. Some cheered, others cursed. The executioner approached, a man cloaked in leather, his hands steady, his face void of mercy. He began with the rope. Wallace was hanged slowly, deliberately, not to death but to the edge of it. His body convulsed as the noose cut into his throat, his face darkening as air was denied him. The crowd roared approval, delighted by the dance of suffocation. But just as life began to fade, the rope was cut. Wallace crumpled to the ground, gasping for breath, forced back into agony so that his suffering could continue. Then came the knives. The executioner opened his flesh with methodical precision, slashing across his abdomen, pulling forth his entrails before the howling mob. Wallace was alive, conscious, every nerve alight with torment. His intestines were torn out and burned before his very eyes, the smoke rising into the air as though to carry his suffering into eternity. The crowd feasted on his pain, their cheers rising with every cut. The cruelty did not stop. His chest was split, his body desecrated piece by piece, yet Wallace did not cry out. His silence was more powerful than any scream. Silence that mocked his executioners, that carried a defiance stronger than flesh. But the final blow was yet to come. Wallace was laid upon the block, his head forced downward. The axe fell swift and merciless, severing his head from his body in a spray of blood. For a moment silence fell, the silence of finality, of death claiming its prize. Then the crowd erupted once more, louder than before. The executioner held the severed head high for all to see, his trophy glistening in the sunlight. The head of William Wallace, once the symbol of rebellion, now paraded as proof of English dominance. But Edward's cruelty went further. Wallace's body was quartered, torn into 4 pieces, each destined to be sent to different corners of England and Scotland as warnings. His head was placed upon a pike at London Bridge, a grim sentinel over the Thames, a message carved not in words but in flesh. This is the price of defiance. And yet, in that horror, a truth remained unbroken. The English could tear his body apart, scatter it across the land and mount his head for all to see. But they could not erase the fire he had lit. The legend of William Wallace had already slipped beyond their grasp, carried in whispers, in songs, in the hearts of those who watched in horror and those who heard the tale. Edward the Fun had sought to destroy a man, but in doing so he created a martyr. Wallace's death was not an end but a beginning, his silence louder than any scream, his blood more enduring than any chain. The execution ground at Smithfield had witnessed many deaths, but none like this. For Wallace's torment, his suffering and his defiance had etched him into history, not as a traitor but as a symbol of freedom. And as the crowd dispersed, their hunger sated, the image remained burned into the minds of all who had seen it, the body of a man torn apart, yet unbroken in spirit. A man who faced the full cruelty of empire, and even in death refused to surrender. The crowd eventually drifted away from Smithfield, their thirst for blood satisfied, their laughter still echoing in the narrow streets of London. For most, the execution was just another spectacle, another brutal reminder of the king's power. But for Scotland, the death of William Wallace was something far greater. It was not the silencing of rebellion, it was the forging of a legend. Word of Wallace's execution spread quickly, carried by travellers, whispered in villages and mourned in cloisters. His severed head may have rotted on London Bridge, his limbs displayed as trophies of conquest, but the memory of his defiance could not be quartered. Scotland had lost its fiercest champion, but in his death he became something untouchable. Scotland remained under Edward's iron grip. The nobles, fractured and fearful, bent to England's demands. Taxes drained the land, soldiers patrolled the streets, and English authority stamped itself deeper into the soil. Yet beneath the surface, Wallace's ghost lingered. His name was whispered around hearthfires, mothers told their children of the man who stood against a king, and songs emerged in secret carrying his story from glen to glen. The English had meant his death as a warning, but the Scots received it as a challenge. If Wallace had fought and died for freedom, what excuse remained for those still living? His execution did not extinguish rebellion, it stoked it. For Edward, the death of Wallace was meant to be the final nail in Scotland's coffin. He had crushed the body, broken the flesh and displayed the remains as proof of dominance. But Edward underestimated the power of martyrdom. Instead of killing resistance, Wallace's execution immortalized it. Edward's cruelty exposed the English crown not as a force of justice, but as a tyrant's machine. He had sought to terrify the Scots into submission, but terror, once unleashed, cannot always be controlled. It can also breed fury. Within a decade, Edward himself was dead, his empire fraying, and the Scots rose once more under Robert the Bruce. The fire Wallace had lit refused to die. History often forgets the details of battles, but it never forgets symbols. Wallace became such a symbol. His silence on the scaffold spoke louder than any plea for mercy. His body may have been torn apart, but his story bound a people together. For centuries, his tale was told not only as the story of a man, but as the story of a nation that refused to bow. He became a mirror for every generation facing oppression, proof that dignity could be preserved even in chains, that freedom was worth any price, even the most brutal of deaths. Beneath the swords and banners, Wallace's story is also one of prejudice, of a people branded as inferior, stripped of their rights, and forced to live under the shadow of another's power. To Edward and his nobles, the Scots were not equals. They were savages to be conquered, mocked, and erased. That is the essence of racism in every age, the attempt to dehumanize, to reduce entire peoples into something less than human. Wallace's struggle shows us what happens when that injustice festers too long. It births rebellion. His life and death are reminders that when dignity is denied, resistance becomes inevitable. Picture it once more, a man, bloodied, broken, and chained, standing before a jeering crowd. The executioners believed they had won, that his suffering would end his cause. But as the axe fell, as the body was torn apart, something greater was born. They killed the man, but they could not kill the idea. Wallace's story endures not because of the brutality of his death, but because of the strength of his defiance. And perhaps that is the truest punishment for Edward the Fawn and every tyrant since, that in their attempt to erase him, they ensured his immortality.